Right, welcome everyone. I'm Dan Murphy. I'm Executive Director of the Massaver Ramani Center for Business and Government. And as many of you know, our mission is to address critical issues at the intersection in the public sector. So I'm thrilled that today's speaker, Paul Sheard, really embodies that with his career. I won't go over all aspects of his career because if I were to do that, I'd take away from the time you all have to spend with him. But I will mention a couple of notes. Paul was vice chairman of S&P Global and chief economist previous to that at Standard & Poor's, Nomura Securities, and Lehman Brothers. He was also the head of Japan equity investments at Baring Assets Management. He's been on the faculty of places like Australian National University and Osaka University and taught at universities like Stanford. And he's also been an active participant in the World Economic Forum's Global Future Council on the new agenda for fiscal and monetary policy. In Japan, he's been, as if that wasn't enough, he's been appointed by 2 different prime ministers to serve on advisory bodies on the Japanese government. So Paul has had a wide-ranging, and I said I can only hit on some of the highlights. Paul has had a wide-ranging and very successful career that bridges both the public and private sectors. He's also an author. He's written several successful books, the most recent of which is The Power of Money, which has been widely and very positively reviewed. We actually have some copies in the back there, so I encourage you to put your name in the jar for the drawing at the end to win a copy of Paul's book, which I'm sure he would be thrilled to sign for you. What I didn't note in Paul's bio, but which I hope had a positive impact on his career, or perhaps he had a positive impact on us, is that we're proud that Paul is an alumni of the Massaver Ramani Center for Business and Government, having been part of our Senior Fellows program. So Paul, it's a delight to welcome you back. I think you're going to speak for perhaps 30, 35 minutes. And my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, is you welcome interaction and questions, comments, challenges from the audience. So please join me in welcoming Paul Sheard.
Thanks very much, Dan, for that gracious introduction. And everybody says this, but it's true. It's fantastic to be back here at the Harvard Kennedy School, Massaver Ramani Center for Business and Government. I did spend 4 years here, although interrupted by COVID, 2 years as a senior fellow and 2 years as a research fellow. And when you take on that kind of commitment or opportunity, you're supposed to write a book. So I'm happy to report. Here it is. I thought that the Massaver Ramani Center for Business and Government was kind of the perfect place, other than the fact that Larry Summers is co-director and Jason Berman is here and all of that obvious stuff. But the subtitle of my book is How Governments and Banks Create Money and Help Us All Prosper. And that sort of resonates well with business and government. So I thought that kind of maps up very well. So I think that the talk today, I've sort of been using a title like Money, Dispelling the Myths, or Dispelling the Myths and Misunderstandings, which kind of, is how my work developed over time. Not so much, not really a deliberate contrarian, but I guess I do like to focus on issues where I think perhaps the consensus has sort of got the narrative of the story a little bit wrong. And that's really, this book. So this book, although I've spent my 4 years at Harvard sort of thinking about it, and of course we have all the great study groups, but also the research meeting 2 or 3 times a year with the other fellows, where you kind of present your work and chapters and things like that. So that was, a great 4 years, but it really reflects, the previous kind of 23 years or so that I was in financial markets. And by the way, my first move into financial markets was as Japan strategist and then head of investments, Japan investments at Baring Asset Management. But we have one of my former colleagues in the audience, George Hoge, well-known in Boston, spent many years at State Street at Global Advisors, and I think was the first person to write a review of my book. And then he sent me one that ChatGPT had done. Yours was better.
Thank you.
But I spent 23 years in financial markets. And when you do that kind of job, chief economist job, you spend a lot of time talking to clients, trying to interpret monetary policy, fiscal policy developments, etc. And in my case, I spent 95 to 2006 in the financial markets based in Tokyo. Then I moved to New York in 2006 with Lehman Brothers as their chief economist. But I was sitting there in March 2001, 19th of March. Japan was meeting just like the Fed has met today. And kind of expecting the Bank of Japan to do something. They'd had zero interest rate policy since February 1999. Raised interest rates once, that didn't work out, cut them back to, or cutting them back to zero. And they launched this thing called quantitative easing. Now, the Bank of Japan didn't call it quantitative easing. At the time, they buried it in other language, a change in the operating target of monetary policy into current account balances. Current account balances or reserves, what are called reserves, very confusing term because people think of foreign exchange reserves. No, forget about them. Federal Reserve System. Reserves are the accounts, the bank accounts that commercial banks have at the Fed or the central bank, Bank of Japan. In Japan, they're often called current account deposits. But I'll call them kind of reserves. And what the Bank of Japan did when it launched this program of quantitative easing back in March 2001 was to essentially say, we've cut the interest rate as far as we cut it, zero. In those days, we thought, and central banks thought zero was the lower bound. My good friend Lucio, sitting in the front row here, spent his career in Brussels. And of course, we now know that several latter part at least, several European central banks, including the European Central Bank, the Danish Central Bank, the Swiss Central Bank, and now, of course, the Bank of Japan, more recently since 2016, have all implemented actual negative interest rate policy. Minus 10 basis and that is charged on the accounts that the banks hold at the central bank. Now, these accounts are different from the sort of accounts that you and I have, presumably you do, at your bank, Citibank or whatever, where you could decide, I'm going to take my money out, whatever. Banks have to hold the amount of reserves that the central bank determines or chooses that they will hold. And the central banks operate so-called open market operations and other operations to make sure that the aggregate level of these bank accounts, reserves, that the banks have at the central bank will be a certain level. So in the old days, that level, I won't go into the details, but it didn't really matter. Nobody paid any attention to it. It was kind of trivial. But with quantitative easing, what the central bank does is sort of buys government debt securities and pays for those government debt securities, usually government bonds, treasuries, bills, bonds, a few other things sometimes, and pays by creating or crediting the reserves, the accounts that the banks have at the central bank. You could call this printing money, printing base money, certainly. And what the Bank of Japan did was to shift to a policy of expanding the amount of reserves in the banking system, and that's essentially quantitative easing. That got me curious and thinking, because this really hadn't been done at that point. The Bank of Japan was not calling it quantitative easing, they were just calling it the change in their operating guideline. Later on, market analysts started to say, oh, this is quantitative easing. But that kind of started me on this journey, if you like, of trying to figure out, well, what's going on with these monetary operations and how does that relate to fiscal policy operations and the banking system more generally. Sort of the genesis, if you like, of my interest in this topic. But when we talk about money, I've got 20, 30 books on money at least on my bookshelf. There are hundreds of books on money. So, why another book on money, you may ask? Good question. And I wanted to do a couple of things in this book. One was to write a book that was technically sound, analytically sound, hopefully. May or may not agree with that, but which was sort of for the general interested readership students, market practitioners, lawyers, policymakers, whoever. Because what my experience over 23 years or so in sort of trying to follow this stuff and explain this stuff, and of course later on we have the financial crisis and the Fed, later on the ECB, Bank of Japan again, they're all doing unconventional monetary policy. And meanwhile, a lot of debt, government debt is building up in the world. So a lot of focus on how should you marry fiscal policy with monetary policy, what's the right combination, et cetera, et cetera. So in my experience in those couple of decades was that there are a lot of misunderstandings, even among participants in financial markets, even sometimes in the language that central bankers even used or central bank gurus would use. And so I wanted to write a book which sort of like laid out things a bit more clearly, explained how these balance sheets fit together, and particularly focus on the issue in the early part of the book. There's a chapter on financial crises later on for Lucio. He's writing a book or just written a book on financial crises. You can't write a book about money and not say, sometimes things go wrong. We have these things called banking crises and sovereign debt crises, etc. Can't write a book on money and not talk about cryptocurrencies. So there's a chapter part at the end about cryptocurrencies. But in the first part of the book, and that's what I'll focus on for the limited time here today, I kind of try to explain where money comes from. And no, not in the sense of the historical development of money, but how does money get into the economy? How does it get into circulation, as we economists like to say? Now, I don't think I put this in the book, and it's not my copyright, but one way to think about this is, we have the real economy, that's the GDP, the goods and services, and we have this monetary economy, the world of finance, the world of money, the world of central banking, fiscal policy, etc. And my first words in the book are from Cabaret, money makes the world go round. So this monetary economy that facilitates the real economy. And so you can think, or I'll try this out, as the real economy as being a bathtub. That's the real economy. You can see where I'm going with this. And money is liquidity. So you fill the bathtub up with water. So that's the money, if you like, in the economy. And if you have too much money, too much water, the bath overflows. You might think of that as being inflation. If you don't have enough money, water, you start shivering. You need more water, not enough water. You might call that deflation. So you need to make sure that somebody needs to make sure that the amount of water in that bathtub is just the right level, maybe even temperature. So the question is, well, how does that water sort of get into the bathtub and get at the right level? The analogy now gets stretched because, well, first of all, how big is that bath? Well, the US economy, GDP is about $27 trillion, goods and services. Trillion is, a lot of zeros in front of the millions. $27 trillion of goods and services. GDP, this is nominal terms, I just quoted the nominal number for simplicity, tends to rise over time as economies expand, driven by technology and capital accumulation, labor force growth, if you have that. What about the water? Well, economists, okay, what money? Of course, hundreds of books of Keynes, Friedman, Lucas, Minsky, Larry Summers, Jason Furman, John Cochrane, the fiscal theory of the price level, Michael Wood, but all this academic stuff is out there. Very abstract models, often macro models, dynamic, stochastic, general equilibrium models, all sorts of fancy stuff. So there's all that. But that stuff tends to be somewhat divorced from the sort of institutions and the plumbing of the financial system, which is kind of what I've been in. How does this plumbing work? How are things actually working in the economy? So economists with money, they've got that literature. And then, of course, everybody knows money. What is money? For something to be sort of qualified as money, it needs to be a unit of account, a medium of exchange, and a store of value. These three. You've read that everywhere. That goes back, by the way, to William Stanley Jevons. I found out when I was doing my research. I thought one of the things I did was go to the library. Where did this unit of account, medium exchange, store of value, who was the first person to kind of come up with that idea? This was in 1800s. 19th century economist, William Stanley Jevons, I think, was the one who, of course, he'd say something like that, and some smart PhD student will always come up with, no, there was somebody earlier. It goes back to Aristotle. But anyway, it's pretty old. And then economists will then have moved, if you get into the sort of the measurement area, well, how do you measure money? What is this? I'm saying water in the bathtub is money, but what exactly, what are we pointing to here? And then we have all the M's. M for money, I guess, M0, M base money, M1, M2, M3, broad money, narrow money, all this stuff. And the most common measure, when economists get down to kind of measuring this stuff, the most common one is M2. In Japan, they like M2 plus CP. But M2, that's cash in circulation. I always carry $20 bill around with me. Banknotes is about $2.3 trillion of this stuff floating around. And demand deposits, and also sort of small lot savings deposits, and a couple of other things. Well, that number comes to about 20 trillion. So now we've got an idea that the bathtub is 27 trillion, the amount of water, M1, is 20 trillion-ish, 2021. Well, if you go back 10 years, real GDP, the size of the nominal GDP, I'm using nominal numbers here, just for kind of simplicity, and also money stock is a nominal variable. I'm using nominal and nominal. Was 17 trillion. And back in those days, M2 was about 10 trillion. So you go back 10 years and just look at the data points. So roughly 10 trillion nominal GDP and 10 trillion money stock, money supply added to the system. So the question then comes, okay, we know the bathtub expanded. We're used to tracking GDP, nominal and then real. But what about the money? How did that extra 10 trillion get in there? Okay. Put you out of your misery. It turns out that even such a simple question, and I'm not going to put you on the spot, although I sometimes kind of do this just to get the conversation going. So where do you think the money comes from? Well, I'm tempted to do that. What would be the top of the list? I feel like I'm back in a study group now. I'm going to say there are three main ways. As always, there are footnotes. And Lucio and George, you can't answer the question. What would be number one on the list of how that money gets into the economy and circulation?
Credit origination.
Yeah, very good. So banks create money when they lend. And that's, in this kind of economy, the most important way that money comes into existence. And again, think of M2 as essentially being, by and large, deposit money in someone's bank account. There's other stuff as well. And this, actually, I think is becoming less controversial. You'll read this in many places now that banks create money when they lend. And that is what the act of lending is. Credit creation is money creation. If you went, I don't know, the local bank down here, wherever it is, what's the local bank, Victoria?
Cambridge Savings Bank.
Okay, Harvard, is the Harvard Savings Bank? Or?
Yeah, the Harvard.
Okay, you go to the Harvard Savings Bank, it may or may not be a good thing. You said, I need, I'm scraping, I need $10,000 to tide me over. And the bank said, okay, you're a Harvard student, whatever, grad student, good risk. We'll give you $10,000. You've got a balance sheet, they've got a balance sheet. You would suddenly have $10,000 in your bank account. That's an asset for you. That's a liability for the bank. That's money. They just created it by giving you that loan. That loan is just an entry on their balance sheet which says $10,000 claim on Victoria. And of course, you have a debt now on the other side of your balance sheet. Individuals necessarily think of balance sheets that much, but we have an implicit balance sheet and we owe $10,000. So that money just came, they say ex nihilo, I think is the term, out of nothing. Banks create money out of thin air. And that's why they're so regulated, by the way. You and I can't go around doing this. We could try, but our IOUs would probably not be accepted readily. But banks operate under a license from the government to be able to engage in that activity. Now, why do I even mention this? Because a lot of people say, hold on, that can't be true. Don't banks collect deposits and then lend out those deposits? Isn't that what banks do? The answer is no, they don't do that at all. If a bank gets a deposit of, say, $10,000, and that deposit came from, a check was written on someone's account at another bank, that $10,000 deposit goes from that other bank to this bank, and both of those banks have accounts at the Fed, and the bank that's losing the $10,000 sees its account fall by $10,000 at the Fed, and the other bank goes up by $10,000. That's what happens to the money. It just shows out on the Fed's balance sheet, and everything nets out. So that's not the way that banks operate. They don't collect savings and then lend those savings for investment. Below people, we have this from some of the macro models that we look at, we have this idea in our head. And also, forget about the money multiplier model. I'll sort of come maybe back to that when I talk about QE again in a minute. But the typical textbook account of how the money multiplies, the central bank supplies base money and it multiplies through the system is basically wrong, but it's in the textbooks. By the way, footnote, somebody just sent me a discussion paper, it's actually a couple of years old, from the Fed, that kind of is, some of the central banks are getting onto this now and saying, actually the way the textbooks are written, fundamentally wrong, and maybe we should be revising some of these textbooks because we're perhaps giving our students a bit of a bum steer. But anyway, so that's just the first way that money comes into that bathtub. That's the most important way. The second way is a bit more controversial and a little bit harder to get your head around because it's a little bit more complicated, as you'll see, which is essentially money comes into existence, certainly what I would define as money, when governments spend, and money is taken out of existence when governments tax. And so if the balance of that is a deficit, that is, a government is spending, it's injecting more money, writing more checks, think of it as writing more checks into the economy than it's taking out through taxation, that is, that accumulates as usually as a government bond stock. And now economists don't, generally speaking, regard government debt securities, treasuries, let's call it treasuries, as being money. They say, no, once the government issues the bond, that sterilizes the money and turns it into a bond, and it's no longer money. That is sort of definitional and somewhat semantic. It's true that government bonds are not used as a means of payment, but I think it's better to think of them as very much a store of value. And it's a kind of money in my view. It's very close to money. Now, again, why is that? Why that little complication I just talked about? I mentioned government debt securities. It's very important. And one thing I always have to kind of stress at this point in any talk is, particularly when I talk about government debt and some of the misunderstandings around that, to make a distinction between an analysis at a fundamental underlying level. So what is kind of almost like the economic laws of physics and gravity? What is true at a fundamental level? And what is true in terms of the way things actually operate in practice? In other words, the institutions that we've developed and the rules and norms, etc. And it turns out those two things are very, very different, and they're different for a causal reason. What do I mean by that? It's because governments can create money, just like banks can, but in a different way, by just writing checks into the economy, that society, and society, place shackles and restraints on the ability of government print money, if you like, create money. So one of the confusing, you often hear about governments printing money. When you hear that term, you should stop and think, what exactly is the person who's making that claim? What do they mean by that? Do they mean the government's running a big budget deficit? Do they mean the central bank is doing quantitative easing? What exactly are they saying? Because we just say print money. But I would say running a budget deficit is printing money. And that can be very problematic for inflation. And history shows if there are no restraints, or if you like, there are no credible commitment institutions or devices introduced, governments will print too much money, engage in too much spending, and you'll get inflation. So it's because of that underlying reality that we arrange things in a way, institutionally, that actually makes it look like that's not true. It's not true that governments can print money. We're really constrained. How has that been done? Well, that's essentially the separation of one part of the government from the other part of the government, one part being the centre, the other part being the fiscal authorities, the Treasury, the Congress. Separate. The Fed is part of the government, but it's independent within the government, not independent of the government. And so let me just go back to my $20 bill for a moment. I always like the $20 bill because it's got Andrew Jackson's face on it. Does anybody, that's a little bit of an inside joke. Can anyone say why I like the fact that Andrew Jackson has his mug on the $20 bill?
He was against paper money and he's on the most circulated bill in the world.
Yeah, sorry, the second part, sorry.
He's on the most circulated bill in the world.
Right, well, that's true, yeah, that's true. And particularly apropos of your point, was it the 1836?
The first, yeah.
The central bank, the US had a central bank. The second central bank, some people say the third, but let's call it the second. And it operated under a charter. And during the presidential election year, or maybe the next year, the charter was going to expire. And whether to extend the charter was a big topic of the election. And to many people's surprise, because people didn't think he'd do it, Andrew Jackson let the charter expire. So from around about that date, don't quote me, I think it was 1836 or so, until 1913, the US operated without a central bank. And so somebody with an impish sense of humor decided to put Andrew Jackson on the $20 bill. But this is a Federal Reserve note. It's a liability of the central bank. And it comes from a bank account. Obviously, that's how you get your hands on it. It's very interesting because US dollars are signed by two people. Two people sign this to give it an air of authority. This is paper money or fiat money. Next question. Who are the two people that have put their signature to this? In terms of not their names, but their functions. I'll let Lucio and George back in now.
So you have the treasurer, she's typically a woman who's appointed treasurer of the United States, not the secretary of the Treasury, but I'm saying the treasurer of the United States and the secretary of the Treasury.
Yes, correct. So, but you cheated because you read the book.
I worked at the Treasury, that's it.
I'm making this not the Federal Reserve, that is right, it is the Treasurer, so the Minister of Finance.
Yeah, so there's two positions. There's Secretary of the Treasury, obviously, but there's a position called the US Treasurer, one of whose jobs is to sign these banknotes. Doesn't sound like a very onerous job. They're not doing it one by one. But interestingly, the chairman of the Federal Reserve doesn't sign this Federal Reserve note, and just sort of underscores the fact that this is very much, the Fed is part of the government, and this is really government paper. So getting back to, so we've created this independent central bank to operate in such a way that constrains the ability of the other part of the government to print too much money. So the independence is one aspect. There's a couple of other technical details, maybe just quickly worth noting. One is, so the central bank is the banker to the banking system. It produces, issues this stuff as well, but it's also the fiscal agent of the government. And this is a less emphasized role. It's less visible to people, although every now and again we have a debt limit crisis and the issue may come up. So the government, the federal government, the Treasury has an account at the Fed, that's on the liability side of the Fed's balance sheet, and all the fiscal operations pretty much go through that account. So if the government writes a check to you as a social, well, as to pay for your services as a civil servant or whatever, or writes a check to Lockheed for some rockets, or writes me a social security check, then its account at the central bank goes down by that amount. And the reserves that we talked about before, they go up one for one when that happens. But so if one of the constraints on the government, which is embedded in the system, is that certainly for the Fed, and I think typically for most central banks, the central bank doesn't allow the government to run an overdraft. Because if the government was able to just keep writing checks, oh, another check, more red ink, that would be potentially problematic. The other thing that typically is not allowed is that the central bank will not buy bonds directly from the government, because that would be in the central bank's balance sheet, deposits would go up, government deposits would go up, and bond holdings by the Fed would go up, and then the government spends the money, okay, issue some more bonds to the central bank. This is called monetary finance often, and that would be a recipe for inflation. It's complicated arrangements. And the other third one is that typically, when there's a budget deficit, it issues bonds. And what that does is, so the issuance of bonds is it will top up its account and will drain the reserves. So running the budget deficit increases reserves, increases deposits in the banking system, and pushes down government deposits at the central bank. Issuing bonds refills up the deposits, drains the reserves, and depending on who buys the bonds, if it's the public, that will expunge the deposits that were built. So the money creation process through both fiscal and monetary policy and the way the two interact, it's a little bit complicated. But bottom line is, you can think of running a deficit as kind of printing money. Now, there's a few insights that follow from that, which I'll just quick, if you kind of buy into this way of thinking, which I do, and which has sort of been popularized by so-called MMT people. And MMT, modern monetary theory, has kind of got a bit of a bad name. It's a bit of a there's always been a battle between the MMT people and the mainstream. And with the big inflation we just had a couple of years ago, still continuing, a lot of people in the mainstream say, see, you were wrong, MMT's nonsense. I look at it a little bit different way of saying, okay, let's put the policy issues to one side. What's really going on here? What's true at a fundamental level? And I think three things are true. One is the government doesn't, again, fundamental level, doesn't really need to borrow in order to spend. Rather, it doesn't borrow money to spend, it creates money when it spends. It doesn't need to raise money, revenue by taxing in order to spend. And most controversial of all is it's not really true that government debt needs to be repaid. It might look like that, but it's not actually the case. And I'll come back to that. But just on the second point, if governments don't tax to raise the money, the reason they don't need to tax to raise money is they can create money by spending. So taxation can't be for that reason at the federal government level. So what's taxation for? I would argue three principal things. One is, and probably closest to the heart of an economist, is taxes are used, and can be used to correct for negative and positive externalities. That's the classic, a carbon tax would be an example of that. The taxes change relative prices and can be used for that purpose. Taxes can be used to redistribute income, particularly from the rich and the well-off to the less well-off. Although you could challenge me on that and say, but hold on, if governments can create money by spending, do they really need to take it from the rich? Actually, technically they don't. And I argue in a different chapter in the book on inequality, that taxing the rich, although it's tempting and has very good optics, is actually not very effective. Because yes, the rich have a lot of money, but what the government needs to do with social programs and everything else is get resources, not get money per se. And when the very rich, uber rich, are taxed, they don't release much by way of resources. So they're not really an efficient target for actually raising resources as opposed to money. And there are other side effects as well.
Sir, what's resources? How would you define that?
Real resources, labor, capital equipment, bricks, computers. That's what That's what the government needs. It's not money that it needs, it's the resources that the money will command. That's what I mean by that. Now, the issue of do central governments don't need to repay debt, that's a long story. I'm looking at the clock. There's a good part of a chapter on that. How can I convince you of that? Well, first of all, just operationally, when treasuries become due, they're refinanced. They're kind of automatically refinanced. That refinancing goes on all day long, every day of the week almost. If you think, well, if the investors whose treasuries are maturing like wanted their money back, they don't want to buy any more treasuries. Sort of what would happen? Well, think of it from their point of view. What would their motivation be? They don't want the treasuries anymore. They want cash, which might go to buy another asset, but whoever sells the asset will get the cash. So the alternative to holding the treasury bills will essentially be somebody holding a deposit in the banking system. And you'll have a lot of trouble convincing me that that's going to be a safer asset, probably a more attractive asset than treasury bills. We call treasury bills the safe asset, or treasury bonds. It's, you know, the anchor of the whole risk-free rate of return, all these kind of terms. Treasuries, government debt securities are a wonderful, liquid, efficient way of transferring holding purchasing power and transferring it into the future if the central bank is doing its job and controlling inflation. There's an if there. But another quick way to think about this, and I probably won't convince you, but if I can find my $20 bill. This doesn't need to be repaid. If you went to I was actually at the Boston Fed before, so that Boston Economic Club, in the Boston Fed building, it was much easier to tell the story, saying, if you took this down to the Fed counter and said, I want my money back, they would take it and give it back to you. That's the nature of fiat money. This is a liability of the central bank. So it never has to be repaid. Now, very careful. It doesn't have to be repaid. That doesn't mean there cannot be too much of it. That's a separate issue. It might actually have to be destroyed. If there's too much money created by the government, and it's that money is being unleashed as purchasing power into the economy and it's causing inflation, the government might want to withdraw some of that. That's called taxing. It's called destroying money. It's not repaying the money, although some people say that's a bit of a distinction without a difference. But that's another argument. There's an electronic version of this, which is the other main liability on the Fed's balance sheet, which is reserves. And reserves are just an electronic version of this. They're different in the sense that you or I cannot hold that electronic version of this. Only commercial banks and some other entities can. But those reserves in the banking system, they never have to be repaid. Again, it's sort of like a perpetual thing. It's almost like a callable perpetual. That is, the central bank can decide to withdraw that money, but there's nothing that says, oh, today is the day those reserves have to be paid back. Now, in the old days, if we had this discussion, people would say, but hold on a minute, Paul, there's trillions of dollars of this stuff has been created in the banking system by the Fed's quantitative easing. Isn't that going to cause inflation? Isn't it inflationary? And the answer is yes, if you print too much money, it becomes inflationary. But the Fed has, and the government more generally, has an ace card, which is the Fed now, and the ECB, I believe, Lucio, and the Bank of Japan, can pay interest on reserves. And that's the difference with this. This doesn't have an interest rate attached to it. Although if it becomes digital, that becomes a possibility. That's where central bank digital currency becomes an interesting issue. But the electronic reserves now that the banks have at the central bank are paid interest. So the interest rate now, had a Fed meeting today, I think it's still 5.4%. So the Fed, the electronic reserves are starting to look a little bit more like a treasury bill, except without a fixed maturity. And instead of the treasury paying out all this interest on its debt, because of the big QE that's happened, now that the Fed is paying out the interest on the debt. And that's now, so it's a different arm of the government. Now, why do I talk about this in the context of debt doesn't really have to be repaid? Is because as a thought experiment, this is more a point of logic than maybe economics in some ways. the central bank, being part of the government, could buy up all of the outstanding debt securities and convert them into central bank money and pay interest on that. And there would be no risk of default. There'd be no risk if we get to a certain day and the government doesn't have the money. In other words, this maturity structure idea, got to pay the money back today, is an artificial construct within the system. There for a reason, but it's not there at an underlying fundamental reason. By the way, we have a close example of this in Japan, where the Bank of Japan has, as of today, more or less, bought up about half of the stock of government debt securities, JGBs. They're not at 100%. They don't want to eliminate the whole JGB market. But there is a real living example of a case where a central bank has gone a long, long way down this path. Now, I hasten to say, this doesn't mean that government debt doesn't matter. There are a couple of reasons why you might, it's a difference. So saying that government debt doesn't have to be repaid per se is different from saying, oh, therefore the government can spend as much money as it likes. Two different propositions. Main reason is that will be inflationary, and that's why we have these systems in place. Second reason is that might look a bit too much like, big deficits, big debt, piling up may look a bit too much like a big government to many people. So depending on your politics and your sort of economic philosophy, you might want to restrict budget deficits and restrict the amount of government debt for those reasons alone, that you want to have a much more market-oriented economy. So there's lots of debates there, but the whole idea that, oh my God, $31 trillion of treasury or federal government borrowings, that's a huge burden on our grandchildren. We've got to do something about it now. That chain of logic, I think, is incorrect. By the way, on the 31 trillion, you hear this number a lot. That includes money that is government debt that's held within the government. And that should be netted out. And if you net it out, and you net out Fed holdings, which again, the Fed has created reserves, and now within the government, the treasuries are held on both sides of the government's balance sheet. The Fed's asset side, the Treasury's liability side, they net out. The number comes down to about 20 trillion. So even as a number, it's less alarming. So I've gone through two ways in which money is created. The second one is more complicated. Third one's probably easier. I'll come back to QE. You might be saying, hold on a minute, Paul said banks create money. I didn't really think about it that way. He's claiming that governments create money through their budget deficit. That's really a fiscal operation. But I thought central banks printed money. Well, they do. It depends on how you define money. If you define money, the way that economists do, as M2, then let's take QE, for example. Its balance sheet pre the 2008 QE was about $900 billion. With all the QE, including the COVID, particularly COVID, it got up to nearly 9 trillion. It's now a little bit below 8, I believe, 7 something. If the Fed had never done any QE, I'm guessing it would be around about $2.5 trillion by now, because there is demand for cash and there is also increase in reserves as well. So call it 2.5 trillion, but it's kind of almost 8 trillion. So there's like, what's that? 5.5 trillion of 8 minus 2, so yeah, 5.5 trillion of kind of base money reserves that have been created through this QE. But I would argue it's a little bit, so that's kind of money printing in a way, but it's a special kind of money printing, because if you're like me and you say, well, the government created reserves in the budget deficit, the issuance of bonds expunged those reserves, base money, turned it into bonds. And now QE reverses that. We're back to where we started. I call this the monetary garden of Eden, portraying my Catholic upbringing. This world in which there's no real separation between the fiscal and the monetary. Printing money just creates reserves, base money. It's not sterilized by bond issuance. Now with QE, we're back to the original state. Then what is that? That is essentially toggling between two different liabilities of the consolidated government, bonds versus reserves. And while those two liabilities are a little bit different, they have liquidity, duration, term structure is a little bit different, and therefore you get what economists and central bankers call the portfolio rebalance effect. That is, there is some monetary easing effect associated with QE, not a huge amount. QE in net terms just substitutes one liability of the government for another. So it's not creating net money, it's changing the composition. So it's a weak and rather limited form of money printing. Now here's one circumstance in which I would put the central bank at the end of this process. It's very much involved. Obviously, its monetary policy is influencing that first way that money is created through the bank lending channel. It's very important, obviously, monetary policy. But in terms of ranking these, I put the central bank like doing QE and printing money that way being third. But there's one circumstance where the central bank really comes into its own, and that is in a financial crisis. So a quick insight on the financial system would be that there's a mismatch systemically in the financial system between the illiquidity of the assets that are kind of financed and created through bank lending and other economic activity, capital, concrete, buildings, this is all illiquid stuff around us, human capital, knowledge, and the liquefaction of the liability side, the claims, if you like, on those illiquid assets. That's the beauty of the financial system. That's to a large extent what money is. It's a very liquid thing that is able to be divorced from this very liquid real economy that is generating the wealth. And if you have a financial crisis and suddenly everybody wants to get their hands on their money, so to speak, well, there is no money in the bank. And that's when the lender of last resort function of the central bank is really, really important. But usually we don't observe that because we don't usually have a financial crisis. But that's, in terms of money, the role of money creation, that's where the central bank really is important. But somewhat ironically, that's the least popular aspect of what a central bank does. Bailouts just sounds terrible, terrible optics, but can be actually kind of quite a saving grace for the economy. So bank credit creation, banks running deficits, central banks doing QE, sometimes lender of last resort operations, three main ways that money, water gets into that bathtub. I think I took a little bit too long there, but hopefully got some time for reactions, questions, brickbats, whatever.
Absolutely. Thank you, Paul. Maybe we can just open the floor to questions. Paul, do you want to field them on your own, or would you?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Great, okay.
I'm really curious about how government would acquire resources rather than money. And is there an example of a government that's done that successfully in an approach to wealth inequality?
Right. So
I had a very similar question. So can I just piggyback a two-finger on that? Because I actually had a question on this too. I failed to understand, and I'm very much new to this, how, not taxing a few rich people for $100,000 and then giving $1,000 to 100 poorer people would reduce inequality.
yeah, so there's a chapter on in the book on inequality. I think it's called the power of money to create wealth and inequality. The sort of two go together. It's a kind of sleeping chapter in this book. Are you Australian by any chance?
Yeah, you got it.
The accent was a dead giveaway.
This chapter it's kind of, you know, you write about inequality and you kind of like, in some sense, not defending it, but trying to explain why it's not necessarily the worst thing in the world, or at least maybe a necessary evil. You know, you're not going to make a lot of friends in this world. But I had this sleeper chapter, and you know, I think some of the most kind of, a lot of the stuff I've talked about here, you know, there are people out there saying a similar thing. The chapter on inequality is probably not my most kind of novel kind of ideas in it. I've never heard other people kind of make the points, some of the points, which maybe if they're wrong, I don't know. But the way I mention that is the Australian Financial Review took excerpt rights from the book. That means they could publish a, you know, whatever 3,000 word feature on any part of the book, and they picked that up and they ran a title something like "Paul Sheard believes CEOs are underpaid." So anyway, read the chapter, and hopefully you'll win a book. So what I was trying to get at there, I probably want to do quickly, is that, so you take the idea of tax the rich, like Elizabeth Warren and people like that. You know, I don't want to get political, but you know, you hear Bernie Sanders say, well, look, we've got a problem. We need the money. We need to, whatever, end homelessness. Jeff Bezos is worth $150 billion. Elon Musk is worth $250 billion. Zuckerberg, $130 billion. They don't need all that money. Let's tax. So I actually have an example in the book of, let's just take Bezos, you know. For example, what if you just sort of, you know, taxed half of his wealth? Well, first of all, getting back to the point I made before, is what the government needs if it wants to end homelessness is not money per se. It's the resources, the concrete, the builders, the carpenters, all the social workers, whatever it is they need. And let's say that costs $100 billion to mobilize those resources. That's what's needed, the resources, not the money. If you buy my argument, you would believe that the government could just write $100 billion worth of checks. That's not the issue. They've got to get those resources. Now, if you're at full employment, the economy is at full employment, which it should be, there are not $100 billion worth of resources sitting around just begging. You're going to have to somehow release those resources. Now, one way of doing it would be to tax Jeff Bezos $100 billion. Windfall tax, one-off piece of legislation. I mean, it wouldn't be legal, wouldn't be constitutional, but you know, just as a thought experiment. The problem is, if you take $100 billion off Jeff Bezos, he's still got $60 or $70 billion left. And he has got what economists call a very low, if not virtually zero, marginal propensity to consume. So the question is, can we get $100 billion from Jeff? Not can we get $100 billion from Jeff Bezos, but by taking $100 billion from Jeff Bezos, will he release enough resources to end homelessness? And the answer is no, he won't. It may feel good to do that, but that's not going to really release those resources. And of course, it could cause a lot of other distortions in the process. So the point is simply that, unfortunately, governments are in a sticky position because, again, if the economy employment and they launch any new program, unless potential growth is increasing because of productivity growth, this is why productivity is so important. If you have a specificity, instead of the US economy being able to produce $27 trillion of goods and services, we have a spurt of productivity. Now it can produce 30 trillion. Now you've got $3 trillion of output, right? We measure it in dollars, but it's $3 trillion of stuff that the government can get its hands on. So it's the stuff that's important, not the money per se.
Because there's no, I mean, I think it's a brilliant idea, but is there an example of it, of a government actually doing that? It seems like, why not do it?
Well, I'm sorry, doing what exactly?
Like taking resources, providing a tax or some sort of.
Well, in a sense, that's what they're doing without kind of being conscious of it to a certain extent, because the government is writing checks all the time. So there's two aspects of, if you look at GDP, the G in the C plus I plus G plus X minus M, if you know that formula. G for government spending is government consumption and government investment. And government consumption is hiring all the public servants that do all the paperwork and people who work at the White House and all this sort of stuff. The investment is, building bridges and I guess, well, how is Lockheed's output? I'm going to get lost in the GDP statistics, but you can think of all that capital equipment investment the government is essentially engineering through its spending. So it's doing that all the time. It's the G in that government spending is a command of the resources in the economy, people, physical resources, concrete, steel, bridges, architects, nurses. But now, what is the taxes doing? It might look like the taxes are paying for that. That's why it looks to the ordinary person. But I would say what the taxes are doing in that context is withdrawing purchasing power from the people on whom the taxes fall. Because if the government's gonna write all these checks, and that's gonna be a command on resources. At full employment, there are no spare resources. So you've got to free up some resources. And taxation is, we think, oh, we're paying for it. We're paying for the government spending. What we're really doing is feeling the pain of having less money, therefore commanding fewer resources. And that indirectly is freeing up resources. One of the magical things about the market economy is nobody really, kind of is conscious of this. When the Fed raises interest rates, what it's trying to, raised 525 basis points in 15 months. What was it trying to do? It was trying to restrain demand. It doesn't know it has models, but it doesn't know how much you're going to decrease your consumption, how much Lucio is going to decrease his consumption. I'm a young person, I was going to buy a house, build my first house, I'll delay it for a year. When the government increases, the central bank increases interest rates, or for that matter, when the government, if it was to raise taxes, that's going to sort of be distributed almost in an invisible way across the economy. But that's kind of what it's doing. It's making sure that supply and demand get back into balance.
I think we have time for one more question.
Yeah.
So speaking of inequality, and I'm trying to link that to the liquidity and illiquidity parts, like assets versus liquid money. And I'm thinking about when government are taxing, no matter the rich, we're assuming it's like a structured taxing, for the rich and the other groups. And then I'm thinking about when you think about that tax that's used to circulate it in the economy, would it be more efficient if we tax the rich with a kind of targeted or intentional thing, that we lead that tax to some kind of structural transformation in the economy to actually that could generate more jobs or more assets, potential assets that would be more effective than just say taxing the rich. Or we say we couldn't see a potential increasing assets. We might as well just not tax the rich and let say Jeff Bezos build more Amazon warehouses.
Right. I mean, again, yeah. So this is it's a complicated debate, and it's very kind of can get emotional. And if so. I don't know, I'm an economist, I have a compassionate heart and I have a kind of hard-nosed heart. It's the bleeding heart and the tough love. And, the compassionate side says, we really got to help these poor people, for example. Then the question becomes, well, then the kind of tough love part is, you get into these, again, very difficult debates about, is tough love better kind of thing. So is welfare dependency, maybe that's a bad thing and we shouldn't go down that path to begin with. So there's sort of those conservative versus kind of more, I don't know, social justice kind of different perspectives depending on where you stand. But let's say for a moment that you really want to do the best way to end, you want to end homelessness, and you say it's going to cost, a certain amount of money to get those resources. We're going to do it year in, year out. Then where do you get those resources from? The thing with the taxing the very rich, I'm talking uber rich in the book. is again, most of like those multi-billion dollar numbers we talked about before is paper wealth, right? I mean, these people have mansions and private jets and things, but most of their wealth is paper wealth. Most of it is stock market capitalization. And when you think about stock market capitalization, so Amazon, didn't check today, but it's $1.5 trillion market cap. I think Apple might be north of $2 trillion market cap. So in other words, what is that? So if you're Jeff Bezos and let's say 80% of your net worth is your stock holding in Amazon, what that in effect is a present day capitalized version of the future profits that Amazon is going to earn. And remarkably, because of the way the stock market works, some of the profits that are being capitalized, in other words, the stock market is making the judgment that this company, for a long way into the future, is going to offer products, it's going to beat the competition, and it's going to offer products to people who willingly will part with their dollars. No one's forcing them. And here's the incredible thing, some of those people haven't even been born yet. So some of the wealth you'll be taking from these uber rich people is this very strange wealth that it's the expectation that future consumers are going to be, gung-ho using Amazon, and the stock market today discounts that back into a stock price. Now, of course, further you in the future, the more heavily those future expected profits are discounted. But my point is, that doesn't get you resources. And the danger, if you sort of go down this route of let's just tax the rich, they get a lot of money, is you could end up distorting the stock market. It's typically why people at the conservative end of politics, they always like to cut taxes and cut capital gains taxes because of this idea that what we want is entrepreneurship, investment, and all this sort of stuff. But can I just end on, and again, I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, but okay, if those very uber rich, you're not going to get much resources, but you really do want to help the poor people, maybe the 10%, 5%, 1%, whatever it is. The only way that you can use taxation, I'm not saying don't use taxation, but the taxation will have to be essentially across the middle class. Because there's, people say there's no middle class left in America. That's not true. But there's still a lot of them, and they're not poor. They can afford to, release some of their consumption, and those resources could be deployed. But this is the politically challenging thing, because we're in a democracy, and you're not going to get a politician or a brave politician who is going to stand up and say, I propose, for a few years at least, to raise taxes on all the middle class, anybody earning over a certain amount. The rich people as well, but it's not going to affect them. Because we need to stop these people, restrain their spending to a certain extent to free up the resources to help this 1% or 2% or 10%. That's not, it might be a humanist, compassionate approach, probably not going to win you a re-election, which probably is one reason why politicians speak a different language. And I take issue with it and say, look, this is not really what's going on here. You can find the money. That's not the problem. You don't want to make the hard political decisions, perhaps, and explain it to the electorate in that way, because it's easy for an economist to blather on like this, but I don't have to get re-elected.
Paul, thank you for the thought-provoking presentation and ideas. I think we've come to the appointed time for the end of the talk, but we have not come to the end of this conversation. So I don't want to speak for you, but I hope you might be available for a few minutes afterwards. If people have questions, they can approach you. And thank you to everyone who joined online. One additional thing is we are going to raffle off a few of your books. So we have the container back here, is that right?